I never expected that something as simple as hanging a new set of curtains would completely change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It's funny how the biggest shifts often come from the smallest, most mundane decisions. For me, it was the choice between linen and velvet and a profound, almost comical inability to use a power drill. But let me take you back, because the story doesn't really start with the curtains. It starts with him. My name is Miles. At the time, I was 28, working from home as a graphic designer, and living in a state of what I'd call comfortable solitude. My apartment was my sanctuary, a perfectly curated space where everything had its place. The couch was just so, the books on the shelves were organized by color, and my computer monitors were angled for optimal light. I had my routine, my work, and my quiet. It was a good life, a safe life. But if I was being honest with myself, usually late at night when the city outside went silent, it was also a lonely one. My building was an old brick walk-up, the kind with charming imperfections and walls that were a little too thin. You learn to live with the muffled sounds of your neighbors' lives, a television show, a burst of laughter, the occasional argument. My life was mostly silent, a low hum of keyboard clicks and soft music. Then, Caleb moved into the apartment across the hall, 3B, and the ambient noise of my world changed. It became richer, more interesting. I saw him for the first time on a Saturday. He was hauling a heavy-looking oak dresser up the stairs with another guy, his t-shirt soaked with sweat and clinging to his back. He was talking and laughing, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that carried easily down the hallway. I just stood in my doorway, pretending to be checking my mail, and watched. He was, for lack of a more sophisticated word, gorgeous. He had broad shoulders and strong arms, the kind that looked like they were used to actual, physical labor. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, and when he finally looked up and saw me staring, he offered a tired but brilliant smile. Almost there, he huffed, and I just managed a weak smile back before retreating into my apartment, my heart doing a strange little flip. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about him in bits and pieces, assembling a mosaic of the man across the hall. His name was Caleb, and he was a carpenter. I'd see him leave early in the morning, smelling faintly of sawdust and coffee, and come back late in the afternoon, often with a fine layer of that same sawdust clinging to his clothes and hair. He seemed to know everyone. He'd stop to chat with our elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, on the landing, or he'd help carry groceries for the young mother on the first floor. He radiated a kind of easy, unforced confidence that I found both intimidating and deeply attractive. He was everything I felt I wasn't. While my days were spent in the quiet, digital world of pixels and fonts, his were filled with the tangible, solid reality of wood and nails. He was loud, in a good way. His apartment was often filled with the sound of friends and music, while mine was a temple of quiet concentration. And, of course, I made the usual assumptions. A guy who looked like that, who carried himself with that kind of straightforward, masculine energy. Well, in my experience, guys like that were never looking for guys like me. So, I filed him away in the mental category labeled hopeless crush and resigned myself to quiet, brief greetings in the hallway. Our interactions were always the same. Hey, Miles, from him as he was coming up the stairs. Morning, Caleb, from me as I was grabbing my mail. We were friendly neighbors, nothing more. But every single time, my stomach would flutter. I would analyze the tone of his voice, the way he smiled. Was that a genuine smile, or just a polite one? Did he hold my gaze for a second longer than necessary? It was foolish, I knew, to read so much into nothing. It was a defense mechanism, a way to feel a connection without risking the sting of reality. This carefully constructed, predictable routine was shattered by a problem that felt monumentally important at the time: the afternoon sun. Every day around 3 o'clock, a relentless beam of sunlight would slice across my living room and hit my main monitor, rendering it almost unusable for a solid hour. My flimsy blinds were useless against it. The solution was obvious. I needed blackout curtains. It was a practical decision, born of professional necessity. I had no idea it was the first step toward dismantling the quiet, lonely fortress I had built around myself. I spent a whole evening online, agonizing over the decision: navy blue or charcoal gray, grommet top or rod pocket. It felt like the most important choice in the world. I finally settled on a thick, heavy set in a dark charcoal velvet. They looked luxurious and, more importantly, impenetrable. They arrived 2 days later in a large cardboard box that I left sitting by the door for another 3 days, daunted by the prospect of actually having to install them. My history with home improvement is, to put it mildly, catastrophic. I'm the guy who hangs a picture frame and ends up with 3 extra holes in the wall and a slightly crooked picture. The idea of drilling into the plaster above my window, of ensuring the rod was level, of dealing with anchors and screws, it filled me with a deep sense of dread. But the 3 o'clock sun was unforgiving, and my work deadlines were real. So, on a Thursday afternoon, I took a deep breath, unpacked the box, and prepared for battle. It was a comedy of errors from the very start. The step stool I owned was wobbly and too short. I had to stretch to reach the top of the window frame, which put me in a precarious, off-balance position. The instructions that came with the curtain rod seemed to be written in a foreign language I couldn't decipher, a cryptic series of diagrams that made no sense. I managed to mark the spots for the brackets, but they were visibly, laughably uneven. Then came the drill. It was a cheap one I'd bought years ago for some forgotten project, and it whined like a dying animal. The bit kept slipping against the old plaster, sending little puffs of white dust into my face. I'd drill for a few seconds, make a pathetic little dent, and then the drill would screech and stop. The sound was awful, a high-pitched grating noise that I was sure was echoing throughout the entire building. I was getting frustrated, covered in a fine layer of white powder, and sweating from exertion and embarrassment. I was standing on the wobbly stool, trying to apply more pressure to the drill, when I dropped a screw. It bounced off the floor and skittered under the couch. I let out a groan of pure frustration, leaning my forehead against the wall. This was impossible. I was defeated by a curtain rod. It was in that moment of silent surrender that I heard a firm, deliberate knock on my apartment door. My blood ran cold. It had to be a noise complaint. It had to be Mr. Henderson, or worse, the landlord. I climbed down from the stool, wiping my dusty hands on my jeans, and walked to the door, steeling myself for an awkward apology. I pulled it open, and my carefully prepared speech died in my throat. It was Caleb. He was leaning against the doorframe, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. He was wearing a simple gray Henley that stretched across his chest, and his hair was damp, like he'd just gotten out of the shower. "Everything okay in there?" he asked, his voice laced with gentle humor. "Sounds like you're trying to build a ship in a bottle with a sledgehammer." My face flushed with heat. Of all the people to witness my complete and utter incompetence, it had to be him. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Yeah? Hi." I stammered, feeling like an idiot. "Sorry about the noise. I'm just trying to hang some curtains." I gestured vaguely behind me toward the scene of the crime. The wobbly stool, the pockmarked wall, the defiant curtain rod lying on the floor. Caleb peeked past me into the apartment, his eyes taking in the chaos. He didn't laugh, though he easily could have. Instead, his expression softened with something that looked like sympathy. "Looks like you're having a bit of a fight," he said. "And I think the wall is winning." I couldn't help but let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. "Yeah, you could say that." There was a brief pause, and I was sure he was about to say, "Well, good luck," and leave. Instead, he pushed himself off the doorframe. "You know, I've got some tools, and I actually know how to use them," he said, his smile widening a little. "I could give you a hand if you want." The offer hung in the air between us. My mind was racing. On one hand, accepting his help meant letting him into my space, my sanctuary, and exposing my helplessness for him to see up close. It was a vulnerable position. But on the other hand, it meant he would be in my apartment, with me. The thought sent a thrill of nervous energy through me that completely overshadowed my embarrassment. And besides, I really needed the help. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to sound casual, as if this were a perfectly normal thing. "I don't want to bother you," he just shrugged. "It's no bother. Beats watching bad reruns on TV. Give me 2 minutes to grab my drill." And just like that, the barrier of my front door, the one that had kept our interactions to brief hallway greetings, was about to be breached. He returned a few minutes later holding a sturdy, professional-looking tool case. He stepped inside, and my apartment, which had always felt like the right size for one person, suddenly seemed much smaller, much more charged. He brought the scent of fresh soap and something else, something clean and masculine, with him. "All right," he said, setting the case down with a satisfying thud. Let's see what we're working with. Watching Caleb work was like watching an artist. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing. He took the cheap tape measure from my hand and replaced it with a heavy-duty one from his kit. He measured the window frame with a swift, decisive motion, his brow furrowed in concentration. He found my pathetic little marks on the wall and chuckled softly. "Were you using your eyes or just guessing?" he teased, and instead of feeling embarrassed, I found myself smiling. "A little of both," I admitted. He made new marks with a pencil he produced from behind his ear, using a level to make sure they were perfectly aligned. The whole process took him less than 30 seconds. Then he picked up his drill. It was a beast compared to my whining little tool. He selected a bit, popped it in, and with a low, powerful whir, he drove a perfect hole into the wall. Then another. There was no slipping, no screeching, just a clean, precise action. It was ridiculously, absurdly attractive. "You need to use wall anchors in this old plaster," he explained, his voice patient and instructive. "Otherwise the screws will just pull right out over time. Especially with heavy curtains like these." He showed me the small plastic anchor, how to tap it into the hole, how it would expand behind the wall to create a secure hold. I found myself leaning in closer to see, our shoulders almost brushing. I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I was so focused on not making my sudden awareness obvious that I barely registered what he was saying. I just nodded, pretending to absorb the lesson. My role in the operation was quickly demoted to assistant. "Can you grab me that bracket?" he'd ask, and I would hurry to pass it to him. "Just hold this steady for a second." I'd stand there, holding one end of the metal rod while he secured the other, my mind racing. This was the most time I had ever spent with him, and it was happening inside my own home. I was acutely aware of everything. The way his bicep flexed when he tightened a screw, the stray curl of dark hair that fell across his forehead, the way he'd bite his lower lip when he was concentrating. As we worked, a tentative conversation began to unfold. He asked me about my design work, his eyes landing on my computer setup in the corner. "So, you're the guy who makes things look good on a screen," he said. I laughed. "Something like that. And you're the guy who makes actual, solid things," he smiled at that. "I guess so. There's something satisfying about building something with your hands, you know? Something you can touch and see at the end of the day." I knew exactly what he meant. My own work felt so ephemeral sometimes, just a collection of pixels that could be deleted with a single click. He told me a little about his work, about a set of custom cabinets he was building for a client, about his love for working with cherry wood. He spoke with a passion that was compelling. He wasn't just a handyman. He was a craftsman. He had a hidden depth, an artistic side that I hadn't expected. It challenged the simple, one-dimensional image I had created of him. He was more than just the handsome, sporty guy across the hall. He was thoughtful. He was interesting. The first curtain was finally ready to be hung. "Okay, pass me the velvet beast," he said with a grin. I handed him the heavy charcoal fabric. He slid it onto the rod with ease, and then, together, we lifted it into place and set it onto the brackets. He did a final tightening of the screws, then stepped back to admire our handiwork. "There," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Not bad." Then came the moment. It was a small thing, so small I could have easily missed it if I wasn't already attuned to his every move. I reached for the power drill to put it back on the floor, at the exact same moment he reached for it. Our hands brushed. It wasn't a quick, accidental tap. For a fraction of a second, his fingers lingered against mine. It was a whisper of a touch, skin against skin, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight through me. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned, my breath catching in my throat. I looked up at him, and his eyes met mine. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was something else, something more serious and questioning. The air between us crackled with a new kind of tension, and the quiet of the room suddenly felt very, very loud. The moment stretched, suspended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The casual, friendly atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by something charged and uncertain. Caleb's eyes held mine, and in their brown depths, I saw a flicker of the same surprise and awareness that I felt. He was the one who broke the silence, but his voice was a little rougher than before. "Okay, one down," he said, clearing his throat and turning his attention back to the window. But the spell wasn't entirely broken. Something had shifted. We both knew it. With the first curtain hanging perfectly, a testament to his skill and my newfound role as chief bracket holder, Caleb stepped back. He reached out and pulled the thick, charcoal velvet closed. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The bright afternoon light vanished, plunging my living room into a deep, intimate twilight. The only light source was the soft glow from the hallway, filtering through the still-open apartment door, which cast him in silhouette. The shapes of my familiar furniture became soft, indistinct shadows. The sounds of the city outside seemed to mute, and the room felt like a private, hidden world. He stood there for a moment, his dark shape framed against the light. I could just make out the line of his shoulders, the shape of his head. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm in the sudden quiet. "There," he said, his voice low, a little deeper in the enclosed space. Total privacy. He turned to face me, and even in the near darkness, I could feel the weight of his gaze. I couldn't read his expression, and that uncertainty made my anxiety spike. And then he said it, the words that I would replay in my mind 100 times over the next few days. "We should test how well they hide us." The sentence hung in the air, simple and yet loaded with 1,000 possible meanings. Was it a joke? A casual, offhand remark about the effectiveness of the curtains? Or was it something else? An invitation? My mind scrambled for a response, for the right thing to say, but I was completely frozen. Hope and fear waged a silent, violent war in my chest. Hope was a fragile, fluttering thing, whispering that this was the moment I had secretly dreamed of. Fear was a cold, heavy stone, telling me I was misreading everything, that I was about to make a fool of myself. He took a single, deliberate step toward me. The space between us, which had felt charged before, now felt electric. He was so close I could have reached out and touched him. I could smell the clean scent of his soap, feel the warmth of his body in the cool, dark air. He didn't say another word. He just stood there, waiting, letting the silence and the darkness do the work. It was a question, posed not with words, but with proximity, and I had no idea how to answer. My breath was trapped in my lungs. My entire world had shrunk to this small, darkened space, to the silhouette of the man in front of me. He lifted a hand, not to touch me, but to reach for the curtain beside my head. His arm brushed against my chest as he did, a slow, deliberate contact that sent a tremor through my entire body. He toyed with the edge of the velvet fabric, his fingers tracing the seam. "Very effective," he murmured, his voice so quiet it was almost a thought. He was so close now, I could feel his breath ghosting across my cheek. The moment was stretched to its absolute limit, a fragile bubble of intimacy that felt like it could pop at any second. I wanted to close the remaining distance between us. I wanted to run. I did neither. I just stood there, paralyzed by the intensity of it all, waiting to see what he would do next. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, as I felt myself swaying almost imperceptibly toward him, he shattered the moment. He dropped his hand from the curtain, took a step back, and the invisible thread connecting us snapped. "Well," he said, his voice suddenly brisk and businesslike, as if the last 2 minutes hadn't happened at all. "That one's done. Just one more to go." He turned away from me and walked toward the other side of the window, becoming just a guy helping his neighbor again. I stood there for a second, my body still buzzing with a phantom charge, my mind reeling. I had to force myself to breathe. In, out. What just happened? Had I imagined the whole thing? The look in his eyes, the change in his voice, the deliberate way his arm had brushed against me? No, I couldn't have. It had felt too real. But his sudden retreat, his swift return to normalcy, threw me into a spiral of confusion and self-doubt. The second curtain went up in a state of strange, unspoken tension. The easy banter from before was gone, replaced by a careful, functional silence. I passed him the screws. He drilled the holes. We lifted the rod together. Our hands didn't touch this time. We moved around each other with a new, stilted awareness, like two dancers who had forgotten the steps to a familiar routine. I was hyper-aware of every move he made, every glance, searching for some sign that what I'd felt was real. But his focus was entirely on the task at hand. He was all business, his expression unreadable. When the job was finally finished, he packed his tools away with the same quiet efficiency he'd started with. He snapped the case shut and walked with me to the door. The bright light of the hallway felt harsh and exposing after the manufactured twilight of my living room. "Well," "There you go," he said, turning to face me in the doorway. No more sun glare at 3 o'clock. His smile was friendly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. There was a distance there that hadn't existed an hour ago. I can't thank you enough, Caleb," I said, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. "Seriously, I would have ended up destroying my wall if you hadn't stepped in." I tried to offer him money, but he waved it away instantly. "Don't worry about it," he said. "It was nothing. Just try not to make any more construction noises for a while, okay?" My ears are still ringing. He was trying for a joke, but it fell a little flat. "Right. No problem," I managed. The goodbye was painfully awkward. We just stood there for a beat too long, the unsaid things hanging in the air between us. Then he gave a small nod. "See you around, Miles." "Yeah, see you," I replied. He turned and walked the few steps to his own door, and I watched him go, my hand still on my doorknob. I closed the door softly and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. The apartment was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was heavy, filled with questions and the lingering ghost of his presence. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. My mind became a courtroom where I was both prosecutor and defense, endlessly litigating the curtain incident. I replayed the moment in the dark over and over again. The way he said, "We should test how well they hide us," the deliberate step he took toward me, the brush of his arm against my chest. Evidence for the prosecution, it was a clear signal of interest. It was intentional, calculated to gauge my reaction. Why else would he say that? Why else would he get so close? Then, the defense would take the stand. Evidence for the defense, it was a joke, a throwaway line. He was just being friendly and maybe a little flirty in a casual, meaningless way. The proximity was an accident, a consequence of being in a small, dark space. His sudden withdrawal and the subsequent awkwardness were proof that he realized I had misinterpreted things, and he was trying to backpedal to save us both from embarrassment. This was the argument that usually won. It was the safer conclusion, the one that protected me from the potential devastation of rejection. I became a master of avoidance. I checked the peephole before leaving my apartment to make sure the coast was clear. I adjusted my mail-checking schedule. The hallway, once a neutral zone, now felt like a minefield. The one time I did run into him, it was excruciating. He was coming in as I was going out. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey." I mumbled back, my eyes fixed on the floor as I hurried past him. I could feel his gaze on my back as I walked down the stairs. The silence was thick with everything we weren't saying. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The beautiful charcoal curtains I had so desperately wanted now felt like a cruel joke. They were a constant, physical reminder of that moment of intense, unresolved possibility. Every time I looked at them, I felt a fresh wave of anxiety and confusion. Had I ruined a potential friendship by wanting more? Had I made him uncomfortable? Or worse, had I imagined the entire spark, projecting my own longing onto a simple act of neighborly kindness? I tried to distract myself with work, burying myself in deadlines and design projects, but my focus was shot. My mind would drift back to him, to the scent of soap and sawdust, to the feeling of his arm brushing my chest. The internal monologue was relentless. Hope was a persistent, nagging voice that wouldn't let me accept the easiest explanation. It kept pointing out the small details, the way his eyes had darkened, the hesitation in his voice. It argued that his awkwardness now wasn't because I had misread the situation, but because he had shown his hand and was now just as scared and uncertain as I was. But that thought was almost more terrifying. If he was interested, what did that mean? What was I supposed to do? I had no experience with this. My romantic life had been a series of brief, fizzled-out connections that never got off the ground. I didn't know how to navigate this kind of delicate, unspoken territory. The fear of rejection was a powerful deterrent. It was easier to believe I had imagined it all than to risk finding out I hadn't and then having to do something about it. So I hid. I hid in my apartment, behind my work, and behind the very curtains he had helped me hang, locked in a miserable stalemate of my own making. 3 days after the curtain installation, 3 days of obsessive overthinking and strategic hallway avoidance. I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at a logo concept I couldn't seem to get right. The sun was setting, and the light in my apartment was soft and gray. I had the curtains partially drawn, a compromise between wanting darkness and needing to see. It was then that I heard the knock. It wasn't the tentative rap of a delivery person. It was firm, deliberate. It was his knock. My heart leaped into my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. I could just sit here in silence until he went away. It would be the easy thing to do, the safe thing. But something else, a braver, more hopeful part of me, took over. I was tired of hiding. I was tired of the uncertainty. Whatever was about to happen, it had to be better than this agonizing limbo. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the door. I took a deep, shaky breath and pulled it open. Caleb was standing there, looking just as nervous as I felt. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his jeans, and he wasn't smiling. He looked vulnerable. It was an expression I had never seen on him before, and it disarmed me completely. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Can we talk for a minute?" I just nodded, my own voice failing me, and stepped back to let him in. He walked into the living room and stood in the middle of the floor, looking around as if he were seeing it for the first time. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I closed the doors softly behind him, shutting out the rest of the world. It was just the two of us now, surrounded by the evidence of our last encounter. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and earnest. "I'm sorry if I've been weird the last few days," he began, finally looking at me. I haven't been able to stop thinking about the other day. When I was here, my heart started beating a frantic, hopeful rhythm. This was it. This was the moment of truth. "Me neither," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. A look of relief washed over his face, so palpable it was like watching a weight being lifted from his shoulders. He took a small step closer. "Good," he breathed out. "I was worried it was just me. I was worried I completely misread things and made you uncomfortable." He ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture of pure anxiety. "Look, Miles, I need to just be straight with you. The line about the curtains, about testing them, that wasn't a joke." He looked me directly in the eye, his gaze steady and intense. "I said that on purpose. I got you into the dark, and I said that because I was hoping. I don't know what I was hoping. I guess I was hoping you'd know what I meant." He let out a humorless laugh. "I've been trying to find a way to talk to you since the day I moved in. You always seemed so quiet and focused, and I didn't know how to approach you without sounding like an idiot. When I heard you struggling with that drill, I saw my chance. It was the perfect excuse to come over here." The confession washed over me, a wave of warmth and validation that chased away all the cold fear and doubt. It wasn't in my head. It was real. "I'm not very good at this," he continued, a flush creeping up his neck. "I see you in the hall, and my brain just short-circuits. All I can manage is, hey." It's pathetic, he was rambling now, the words tumbling out in a rush of nervous energy. "The point is, I like you, Miles. A lot. And that moment in the dark, that was me trying, in a really clumsy way, to show you that. And then I panicked. I thought I'd pushed too hard, so I backed off, and I've been kicking myself ever since." I finally found my voice. "You didn't push too hard," I said, a real smile spreading across my face for the first time in days. "I panicked too. I thought I had imagined the whole thing." A slow smile dawned on his face, mirroring my own. The tension in the room dissolved, replaced by a giddy, breathless relief. "So you felt it too?" he asked, his voice full of hope. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Yeah," I finally managed. "I definitely felt it." He closed the remaining distance between us, stopping just inches away. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. He tentatively reached out and cupped my cheek, his thumb stroking my skin. His hand was warm and slightly rough, and the simple touch was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. "Good," he murmured. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't like the kiss I had imagined, tentative or questioning. It was confident and sure, a kiss that tasted of relief and apology and 100 unspoken things. It was a confirmation. It was a beginning. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. "So," he whispered, a smile in his voice. "About those curtains." The weeks that followed that conversation felt like waking up from a long, gray dream into a world of vibrant color. The awkward hallway greetings were replaced by stolen kisses in the doorway. The silence of my apartment was now frequently broken by his easy laughter, by the sound of his favorite music playing from my speakers, by the low rumble of his voice as we talked late into the night. He filled the empty spaces in my home and in my life that I hadn't even realized were there. We fell into a rhythm that felt both new and completely natural. We went on dates, to a small Italian restaurant he loved, to a movie I wanted to see, to a hardware store, which he insisted was a perfectly legitimate date activity. We learned about each other's worlds. I showed him the intricacies of my design software, and he showed me the difference between a dovetail and a mortise and tenon joint. He had a surprising eye for color and composition, and I discovered a hidden talent for holding a piece of wood steady while he sanded it. We fit together in ways that were unexpected and wonderful. The curtains, of course, became an inside joke. "Time to test the privacy again?" he'd ask with a sly grin whenever he came over in the evening. They were no longer a symbol of my anxiety and loneliness, but a monument to the beginning of our story. They were a reminder of how a moment of total incompetence on my part had led to the best thing that had ever happened to me. He made my perfectly curated apartment feel less like a sterile sanctuary and more like a home. He'd leave a coffee mug on the wrong coaster or drape his jacket over the back of a chair, and instead of twitching with the need to fix it, I'd just smile. It was the beautiful, welcome mess of a shared life. One Saturday morning, a few months later, I woke up to the smell of coffee. The morning sun was filtering through the curtains, casting the room in that familiar, soft twilight. Caleb was moving around in the kitchen, the quiet sounds of him making breakfast a comforting backdrop to my slow awakening. I lay there for a moment, just listening, feeling a sense of peace that was so profound it almost hurt. He came back into the bedroom holding 2 mugs, a gentle smile on his face. He handed one to me and sat on the edge of the bed. We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of light that broke through the velvet. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "You know," I said quietly, looking from our joined hands to his face. "I almost didn't open the door that day." He squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you did," he said, his voice soft. "I was about 30 seconds away from faking a plumbing emergency in my own apartment, just so I'd have another excuse to talk to you." I laughed, the sound filling the quiet room. It was amazing, really. We had both been on opposite sides of the same wall, trapped in our own anxieties, just waiting for someone to make the first move. It's true what they say, I think. Sometimes the biggest risks are the ones we take not by leaping off a cliff, but by simply opening a door. You let someone into your carefully controlled world. You let them see your imperfections. You let them help you hang your curtains. You move from a place of passive observation to active vulnerability, and in doing so, you create space for a connection you never thought possible. Life has a funny way of working out. You spend years building walls to protect yourself, only to discover that all you ever really needed was to let someone in to help you put up the right kind of curtains.